you all for coming out to this Founders Day 2026 program. This is an important university holiday that the Generals Redoubt is happy to continue, and in the spirit of America's 250th anniversary and the revolutionary fervor that swept this place 250 years ago and continue to for many years after, we thought we would have a program focusing on George Washington and the founding generation that were influenced by those legacies of liberties. Before I introduce Ryan Cole, our speaker tonight, I just want to say a little bit about the work that he has done, particularly a book he wrote, I guess, 6 years ago now on Light Horse Harry Lee. Many people know about the Lees. They know about Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general and president of what is now Washington and Lee University. Very few people know about Lee's father, Light Horse. And that's because Light Horse died in somewhat obscure, tragic conditions, and I'm sure Ryan can talk more about that. But my favorite fact about Light Horse Lee is that he was one of George Washington's closest friends, one of his closest proteges, and he was a true champion of free press, the freedom of press. He suffered gruesome scars from an anti-war, War of 1812 incident he was in. He's really a critical figure who I think represents so many of the guiding values of that founding generation, an imperfect figure by many means, but certainly an important person to talk about this year. And as many of you will know, he is buried just a few hundred yards away in the chapel, Lee Chapel, entombed there in 1913. So great historical figure. And Ryan, of course, has written a more recent book called The Last Adieu, which I happened to find out as I was reading Light Horse Harry Lee about 6 months ago. I said, man, this book is so good. I'd love to connect with this author. So I Googled him, and it said, releasing this week, The Last Adieu. And I thought, wow, what perfect timing. He's already written another book, so I can have him come and speak about both of them. And so that's what we're excited to do today. Ryan is a great researcher. If you have read his books, you'll see that's very clear. He really gets down to the character of the people he's writing about. He has a background in politics and really knows how to tell a compelling story. And so I'm happy to invite Ryan here. And Ryan is much like the Marquis de Lafayette. He's going on a grand tour around the United States. This is hopefully one of his top destinations so far, but I know he's recently been at Henry Clay's home in Kentucky and in Ohio and all over, so really trying to travel in the footsteps of the Marquis de Lafayette, the last major general of the American Revolution. So Ryan will come up and say a little bit about these two, their legacies, connection to Washington. Then we'll do an audience Q&A and follow with the reception at the Patton Room. Again, you all are invited to that. So thank you so much. Let's give Ryan a hand.
Thank you all for coming. I'm actually really surprised to be here because in the spring of 2020, I was very graciously invited to deliver the Lee Chapel Spring Lecture about Henry Lee III, who I just published a biography of. Okay, better? Do you want me to start over again from the beginning? Did you miss anything? Okay, so I was saying that in the spring of 2020, I was invited to give the Lee Chapel Lecture on Henry Lee III, who I just written a biography of, and then this was the spring of 2020, so then March arrived. I'd made my travel plans and written my remarks, and then a global pandemic began, and the rest is history, obviously. So it was disappointing, but it was pretty minor disappointment compared to everything else that was happening that year. But I didn't think I'd ever get another chance to come speak on this campus. So 6 years and another book later, here I am. So life is full of surprises. So Cameron, thank you for doing so much work to make this happen, and to the Generals Redoubt, and who so generously invited me to be here today. Thanks for the second chance. Just in time for the 250th of the Revolution also, so it's perfect. Like I said, life is full of surprises. And it's hard to think of the lives of two men associated with our revolution that were so full of surprises, twists and turns, triumphs and tragedies, and great drama, as Gilbert de Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Henry Lee III, Light Horse Harry Lee. They were brilliant warriors, champions of liberty, idealists to a fault, and though their personalities were dissimilar, Lee was brooding and Lafayette was overconfident, optimistic. They both shared, in Thomas Jefferson's words about Lafayette, a canine appetite for fame, and they were both keepers of the flame of the American Revolution. One wrote an important early history of the war, and another was at the center of a national celebration around its memory. It was the event that defined their lives long after it had ended, and of course, they were both, as Cameron mentioned about Lee, proteges of George Washington. One was his adopted son, the other was his great eulogizer, and he admired both of them greatly. And after the revolution ended, they spent the rest of their lives chasing the opportunities that it promised. In the case of Lee, that was fortune and glory. For Lafayette was the spread of liberty, often with disappointing results. And after their service with Washington concluded, they relied on him for instruction, and once he was gone, they revered him to their own dying days. And though it was only the opening act of their lives, they were defined by their service in the Continental Army and their connection to its commander-in-chief. Light Horse Harry Lee and the Marquis de Lafayette were actually born a year apart, 1756 and 1757. Their family estates, Leesylvania in Prince William County, Virginia, and the Chateau de Chauvigny in Auvergne. One was a French nobleman, the other was a member of the Virginia gentry. Their studies, Lee's at the College of New Jersey, Lafayette's at the Collège du Palais in Paris, stirred notions of heroism, honor, and virtue. We can identify the moment that they decided to pursue them in America's Revolution. For Lee, it was in April 1775, when he dined with Washington, who soon depart for Philadelphia, where he would be named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and Charles Lee, the unrelated, eccentric British soldier of fortune, who famously preferred the companionship of dogs to men. Shortly after, the younger Lee wrote to the older Lee that he was ready for commencement in the study of Mars. For Lafayette, it was in August of 1776 when he attended dinner when he was stationed in Metz near the German border. The guest of honor was King George III's younger brother. He shared correspondence recently received from England regarding their colonies, which were now in revolt. Before the evening was over, Lafayette, in his own words, conceived of the idea of going to America. For Lee, it meant using his familial connections to become a captain in the Virginia cavalry. For Lafayette, it was the promise of a major generalship from the American agent in Paris, Silas Deane. He purchased a ship to cross the Atlantic, left behind a pregnant wife, a disapproving family, and then made a terrible journey from South Carolina to Philadelphia to obtain that commission. Lee had known George Washington since he was a boy. His father, Henry Lee II, was a colleague and friend of the commander-in-chief. Leesylvania was just south of Mount Vernon on the Potomac. Lafayette, on the other hand, first met Washington at a dinner held at Philadelphia City Tavern on August 1777. After they were introduced and the dinner was ending, the commander-in-chief pulled the young soldier aside and encouraged him to feel welcome at headquarters. The young soldier's paths crossed at Brandywine. Lafayette took a ball beneath his calf on his left leg, rallying American soldiers. Lee's troop helped cover their retreat. They became friends, part of the band of younger officers in Washington's orbit. They grew to admire one another, though Lee distrusted foreign-born soldiers in the American army. Not Lafayette, though. Lafayette steadily grew into the role of a major general. He earned the trust and admiration of the Americans by embracing their values and, in his own words, promising to learn, not to teach. After he set the Hessian pickets retreating during the Battle of Gloucester, New Jersey, at Washington's urging, Congress awarded Lafayette command of his own division. He skillfully led the escape from the British Army outside of Philadelphia at Barron Hill. He helped salvage symbolic victory at Monmouth Courthouse. Lee's heroics, on the other hand, were not usually during the legendary battles whose names we remember, though he was present at many. He was the eagle who swooped out of the sky, excelling at improvised partisan warfare. employing guerrilla tactics, raiding British supply trains, taking prisoners to Washington along with clothing and food to his cold and hungry soldiers. At Scott's farmhouse west of Philadelphia, Lee, with 80 men, blew back a British force of 80. 8 versus 80. Those were the type of odds Henry really liked. An offer to join the commander-in-chief's administrative family came soon after. It's a great opportunity for a young soldier, opening many doors. Lee declined, explaining to Washington that he was, quote, wedded to my sword, and that my secondary object in the present war is military reputation. Washington didn't even bat an eye. He made him a major, gave him command of his own legion. Lee planned the daring and successful nighttime raid on Paulus Hook, a supposedly impregnable installation poking out of the confluence of the Hudson and Hackensack rivers. The more I have considered the situation at Paulus Hook, the more I have admired your enterprising spirit and all your conduct in that business, Lafayette wrote to Lee afterwards. Congress awarded Lee a medal, the only one awarded to a soldier below the rank of general during the Revolution. Washington sent him south to fight for Nathanael Greene, the perfect complement to the general's inventive use of his army in tandem with maneuverable partisans. Lee's legion was between Greene's army and Lord Cornwallis as they raced towards the Dan River. He tore through South Carolina, conquering British posts with improvised towers built from trees and storms of fire-tipped arrows. He fought at the siege of 96, the battles of Guilford Courthouse and Eutaw Springs. During the opening rounds of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Lee prowled back and forth among the militiamen on the front lines, brandishing a blood-stained sword. In his face, a veteran remembered, was a great rage for battle. Lee pled with the rebels to give the British hell. He assured them they had no reason to fear the enemy. He had whipped them 3 times already that morning and would most certainly do so again. Now, the British won those battles, but at too great a cost. Lee played a crucial part in the strategy that liberated the South and sent Cornwallis north into Virginia. And there he found the young Frenchman. Lafayette had returned to France in 1779, rallied support for the American cause, returned stateside in 1780, when the chances of victory appeared to be on the wane. During that terrible year, defeats in the South, the treason of Benedict Arnold, the brutal winter at Morristown, when the American cause seemed so low, Lee felt some of the blame fell on the selfishness and the insufficiently patriotic civilian population, a belief that influenced his desire for a stronger government later. Lafayette, interestingly, chided Lee for making jokes that were, in his words, diametrically opposed to Republican principles. Washington dispatched the Frenchman southward, the head of his own corps, to stop Benedict Arnold's raids on supply depots in Virginia. When Cornwallis moved north into Virginia, Lafayette followed. He feinted, he attacked, he retreated. They trapped the enemy at his base at the York River. The French fleet blocked the Chesapeake Bay after the Battle of the Capes. And Washington's forces marched to Virginia, rendezvoused with Lafayette, trapped Cornwallis, sieged Yorktown, forced the British general to surrender, eventually leading to American independence. And Lee was there, but only as a spectator, sent north by Greene to consult with Washington regarding future plans in the South. And this was symbolic. While his friend Lafayette basked in the glory, Lee felt improperly acknowledged. He was exhausted. His lust for glory was unsatisfied. He left the army in a fit of melancholy. Greene pleaded with him to stay, then relented with a warning. You cannot cease to be a soldier. And he was right. Lee tried, though. He went home to Virginia. He married the dark-haired and musical Matilda Lee, the divine Matilda, the mistress of Stratford Hall, the grand Georgian mansion and plantation on the Potomac in Westmoreland County. Lee, by the way, hung a portrait of Lafayette on the walls there. He tried his hand at farming. George Washington, he was not. The transition to domesticity was not easy. A cousin, Arthur Lee, observed the young couple. Quote, vexation, torment, torture, Matilda Lee crying, Harry Lee ranting, delightful group for a social party. Lee found another distraction, speculating in land, buying parcels in hope that as the population moved westward, its value would rise, making the owner a fortune. He had starry eyes but little skill for this game, and he quickly spent himself into debt. One example of his carelessness, he swapped 5,000 acres of Kentucky land with Washington for a magnificent stallion named Magnolia. Some years later, Washington discovered that the land had already been sold to Alexander Spotswood. Washington refused to believe Lee was guilty of fraud, though. And indeed, Lee's bad business transactions were the result of carelessness rather than criminal intent. When he wasn't dealing in land, Lee followed the family tradition, launching a career in politics. And here he made significant contributions to our country. He served in Virginia's legislature and then in the Congress of the Confederation, where he was alarmed by the feeble government's ability to manage the nation's affairs. When a Constitution was crafted and sent to the states, Lee joined James Madison and John Marshall in the effort to ratify it in Richmond in the summer of 1788. There he clashed with and held his own debate against the silver-tongued Patrick Henry. He made the argument in granting Congress the power to raise a standing army. This was important, he said. After all, he had seen militia crumble during the Revolution. And he made an appeal for the Constitution based on a union of states, influenced by serving alongside men from all the other colonies. Quote, "From the terms in which some of the northern states were spoken of, one would have thought that the love of an American was in some degree criminal, as being incompatible with a proper degree of affection for a Virginian. The people of America, sir, are one people," he said. "In all local matters I shall be Virginian, and those of general nature I shall not forget that I am an American." Of course, the Friends of the Constitution carried the day, and when a new government was created, Lee joined the chorus of countrymen urging Washington to lead it. "Without you," he warned Washington, "the government can have but little chance of success." Washington assumed the presidency. Lee's old friend Alexander Hamilton took control of the nation's finances. And soon, his greatest passion project, land near the soon-to-be navigable Great Falls on the Potomac, would, he hoped, grow with the nation into a prospering city. But a sharp reversal of fortune followed. He couldn't take ownership of the land or find investors to help him pay back taxes owed on it. He was horrified by Hamilton's plan for the federal government to assume the state's debts. He second-guessed the Constitution he had supported. His wife Matilda's health faded. She gave birth to a boy, Nathaniel Greenlee, who died in infancy. Then, in August 1790, the divine Matilda died. It fell to Washington to offer perspective to the grieving Lee. Quote, "As the ways of Providence are as inscrutable as just, it becomes the children of it to submit with resignation and fortitude to its decrees as far as the feelings of humanity will allow." Lee drifted. He turned his back on the new government. He railed against the administration. He didn't let politics interfere with his friendships with Washington and Hamilton. But he was elected governor of Virginia. In Richmond, he cut a dashing figure, the handsome grieving widower riding across the city's primitive roads in a polished chariot pulled by 6 fine horses. In 1792, another son, Philip Ludwell Lee, died. Reasoning, in his words, he was as suited to war as peace, he eyed an escape from his misery, a return to battle, this time in the French Revolutionary conflict against Austria. The old friend he wrote to in search of a commission in the French army, Lafayette. His letter to Lafayette, however, went unanswered. The now former Marquis had much graver matters to attend to. After Yorktown, he went back home to France in 1871 and received a hero's welcome. He returned to America for a tour in 1874, visiting with Washington and Mount Vernon, before bidding a final farewell between Annapolis and Baltimore. In 1788, when the Philadelphia Convention created a constitution, Lafayette was overjoyed. The new government it proposed was imperfect, however, unless a, quote, guardian angel could guide its initial steps. "Permit me once more, my beloved general," he wrote to Washington, "to insist on your acceptance of the presidency." Soon after, Lafayette had his own heroic turn in the early chapters of the French Revolution, advocating for liberal reforms influenced by the American Revolution, consulting with Thomas Jefferson while drafting an unused Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and as head of the Parisian National Guard, presided over the Bastille's demolition. Afterwards, he shipped the keys of the fortress to Washington. They were displayed in the president's residences in New York and Philadelphia before returning with him to Mount Vernon, where many of you probably have seen them. The gift was, Lafayette wrote, a tribute which I owe as a son to my adoptive father. The zenith of his popularity was on the 14th of July, 1790, the one-year anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, when the French people affirmed their nationhood under a soon-to-be-created constitutional monarchy. I reign in Paris, Lafayette boasted. The reign did not last long. Control of the National Guard slipped through his hand. Radicals and royals alike suspected him of insufficient loyalty, of using the National Guard as a means to advance his own fame. He was blamed for the near escape of the king and queen. When the National Guard opened fire on a crowd of protesters at the Champ de Mars, his standing eroded further. August 19, 1792, he set off for the Belgian border in search of asylum in a neutral country. From there, he planned to travel to Holland, then to England, where he would gather his family and flee to America. Lafayette was arrested by the Prussian authorities, passed between prisons, eventually locked away from the world in the Olmütz Castle in a damp chamber with little else than a single change of clothes. Washington was reluctant to intervene on behalf of Lafayette, weary avoiding neutrality between warring European nations. But the outrage over Lafayette's imprisonment was felt widely among Americans. Washington himself, in the capacity of a private citizen, wrote to Emperor Francis II, expressing his desire to see Lafayette released. It was another general who made this possible. Napoleon Bonaparte vanquished the Austrians in Italy, then trained his sights on Vienna. When the Austrians pursued peace, the liberation of French prisoners was part of the pact. In September 1797, Lafayette and his family were liberated, escorted to Hamburg, and handed over to the American consul there. I long to be in America, he wrote to Washington a year and a half later. But new political factions resulting from divisions created by France's war with Great Britain made that impossible. Instead, in 1799, Lafayette returned to France. Bonaparte, alarmed by the return of a potential rival, permitted it on the condition that Lafayette would find purpose beyond politics and away from Paris. In the interim, the political winds that made it impossible for Lee to return to America made it possible for Lafayette to return to America helped balance Lee. The idea of running off to fight with the French army, it fell to Washington to convince him of the foolishness of that idea, particularly as the chief executive of one of America's largest states. Lee took Washington's advice, admitted that the concept was madness. He backed away from opposition to the federal government, concluding, in his own words, effectual opposition may beget civil discord and civil war. He had already fought in one civil war. He had no desire to see another one. So he took another bride, Anne Hill Carter, the daughter of one of Virginia's first families. Lafayette supported Washington's stance of neutrality in France and Great Britain's war. He was alarmed by the formation of new political societies, hostile to the new government and sympathetic to the French revolutionaries, sensing a dangerous form of partisanship. Spirited disagreements were one thing. Desire to see the government fall and the president fail were another. In 1794, a federal tax on spirits triggered a rebellion by farmers in western Pennsylvania who used whiskey as something close to currency. Washington and Hamilton viewed this as the first legitimate threat to the federal government. They raised an army of 13,000 men to stamp out this whiskey rebellion. They made Lee a major general and put him at its head. Lee was lauded for his conduct during the expedition, but he was removed from the governorship when he returned home by a legislature offended he had participated in such an exercise of federal power, and increasingly dominated by allies of Thomas Jefferson. Lee, now a Federalist, was elected to Congress in 1799. George Washington voted for him. When he arrived in Philadelphia to take a seat in December of that year, passengers on the stage from Alexandria had taken news from Mount Vernon and spread it to Baltimore and then on to the Capitol. Washington was dead. Congress resolved to hold a grand memorial and naturally picked Lee as the man to deliver the eulogy. He had delivered Washington's farewell address when he left Alexandria to assume the presidency. He had delivered a eulogy for Patrick Henry. He was known for his strutting oratory. On December 26th, at the end of a long procession winding from Congress Hall to Zion Lutheran Church, Lee stood before a crowd of thousands to describe Washington as, you probably know the words, first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen. Lee, for a moment, basked in glory. Lafayette, on the other hand, was not even invited to the public memorial ceremony for Washington held in Paris. My mind is so used to introduce him in every thought, every sentiment, every concern of mine, that I hardly can believe that while I am living, he has left us, Lafayette wrote to Martha Washington. Both Lee and Lafayette entered periods of calamity and exile. With Jefferson's election to the presidency, Lee's political career was at an end. The project at Great Falls, now known as Matildaville, collapsed. Creditors hounded him. Lawsuits piled up. Attempting to avoid them, he was on the run, rarely at Stratford Hall. When Anne gave birth to a boy named Robert in January 1807, Lee was absent. The list of men he owed money to was extensive. It included the estates of Patrick Henry and George Washington. One of those who Lee owed to was allowed into Stratford Hall to claim some household goods. When Lee found out about this, he stormed onto the man's property, tore down his fences, dashed across his yard, trespassed into his home, and in a wild free-for-all grabbed bedding, tables, chairs, knives, forks, dishes, meats, and liquors, and then he gored an axe on his way out for good measure. By the end of the decade, Lee's running had ended. In April 1809, he surrendered and was taken to Montrose Courthouse and locked in a 12 by 15-foot room for his debts. Amazingly, under such duress, he wrote his memoirs, drawn from his own memory and the memories of fellow veterans who he corresponded with from jail. It was brilliant, egotistical, colorful, wildly discursive, classic Harry Lee. A fellow soldier who received great praise in Lee's memoir was Lafayette, notable for, in the author's words, his zeal, courage, humanity, and goodness. In the first decade of the 19th century, emulating his mentor's retreat at Mount Vernon, Lafayette threw himself into farming, filling the stalls at his home LaGrange, 30 miles southeast of Paris. There were chances to return to America, offers of the French ambassadorship, the governorship of Louisiana Territory. But Lafayette, who struggled to pay his own debts, declined. On Christmas Eve, 1807, his wife Adrienne died. "Before this blow, I confess," he wrote to Jefferson, "I did not know what it was to be unhappy." Other than a brief return to public life, winning a seat in the Chamber of Deputies, where he helped convince Napoleon to abdicate after Waterloo, Lafayette remained on his farm, in the words of a fellow veteran of the Revolution, awaiting a better state of things. For Lee, there was to be no better state of things. In May 1810, he was freed from prison. At the end of the year, he moved his family to Alexandria. 2 years later, another war with Great Britain began. Lee opposed it, but he would have gladly served in it if asked. When a Federalist printer named Alexander Hanson was chased from the Democratic Republican city of Baltimore, Lee came to his defense. Hanson and a small band, led by Lee, held up in a home in the city's center. A mob gathered outside. The Federalists were escorted to the city jail. The mob followed them there. They broke into the prison. Lee and his friends attempted to escape. He was grabbed, clubbed on the head, tossed down a flight of stairs. One of the mob approached Lee, drew back his blade, and began to slice off his nose. Unable to take the entire thing off, he left Lee with a giant gash in the middle of his face. Another knife was thrust at his eye. Just as it reached Lee's face, he sat up, blocking the weapon, which instead ripped through his cheek. To measure if any life remained, Lee's eyelids were peeled open and scalding candle wax was dripped over his pupils. When the mob dispersed, Lee was whisked away to York, Pennsylvania, and treated by doctors. He returned to Alexandria a broken man. The dashing hero of the Revolution was now a disfigured monster who scared children in the pews of Christ Church in Alexandria. He eyed an escape for warmer climates. President Madison granted his old friend, they had gone to college in New Jersey together, permission to pass through the blockaded Chesapeake Bay and sail for the West Indies. He spent the last 5 years of his life wandering there among the islands, relying on the kindness or gullibility of strangers, writing letters home to his wife and children, sending cloth, coffee, coconuts, while scribbling a lifetime of observations and increasingly deranged sentiments in a diary, which is housed in this building. In 1818, he longed to return to America and to Virginia. He caught a ride on a ship home. In order to pay off his debts in New Providence, he was given a loan from a widow who had fed and taken care of him. In return, he gave her a note of credit from a bank in Savannah, a bank in which he had never held any money. Near the Georgia coast, he asked to be left off at Dungeness on Cumberland Island, the home of Nathaniel Greene's daughter, Louisa Shaw. He was a dying man. Doctors were summoned. When a surgical procedure was suggested, Lee refused, saying, "My dear sir, were the great Washington alive and here, and joining you in advocating it, I would resist." On Wednesday, March 25th, 1818, Lee died. He was buried in a small island on the estate. It's a wonderful line in obituary from a Southern newspaper in 1818. "Gallant spirit, farewell. The thorns which ingratitude had placed in thy path have ceased their vexation." 6 years later, a young Virginian named Jonathan Ambler, who had recently graduated from school and was traveling in Europe, taking his grand tour, arrived in Paris. Now, if you were an American in Paris at the time, and Lafayette was there serving in the Chamber of Deputies, you went to see him. No American was a stranger, either at his home in Paris or at the Grange. So Ambler, after arriving in Paris, found Lafayette and had an audience with him, as any American was obliged to do. When they met, the old man insisted that the younger one sit beside him. He asked him if he spoke any French. Ambler didn't. Lafayette said he was in the same predicament when he came to America, didn't speak any English. And then, of course, he shared stories of the American Revolution and George Washington, and another Virginia. In the story Lafayette told, Washington held out the Bible to each of his officers, who in turn swore their allegiance to America and renounced the British monarch and his family. In the process of doing this, he came to one particularly brash soldier. Hesitantly, the soldier extended his hand towards the Bible, then drew it back. Then he repeated the same motion. What was the reason for this conduct so strange, Washington asked. George III was a tyrant, and he hated him, Henry Lee III declared. But as regards to the Prince Regent, he might be a good fellow, he said, provoking a round of laughter. Now, Lafayette was not alone in his nostalgia for the American Revolution. Across the Atlantic, there was a boom of interest in the period which corresponded to the approach of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1826. Lee's exile from America had been 5 years. Lafayette's estrangement from his adopted country had lasted for 40. At 66, he was now the last surviving major general of its Revolutionary Army. And when the Bourbon monarchy was restored, Lafayette despaired over the fate of liberty in France and across Europe. Adding insult to injury, in early 1824, he was voted out of his seat in the Chamber of Deputies, which was the lower house of the French Parliament. Just as his enemies in the French government sealed his fate, Lafayette's friends in America conspired to revive his fortunes. In February 1824, Congress passed a resolution formally inviting Lafayette to return to America and offered him the use of a national ship to bring him here, which he declined. On July 13th, he left on a packet ship, the Cadmus, departed with Lafayette, his son, George Washington Lafayette, who had lived at Mount Vernon briefly during Lafayette's imprisonment, and a secretary named Auguste Levasseur, destined for New York. The question is, what awaited them across the Atlantic? What had become of the Project in Liberty that Washington and Lee and Lafayette had helped begin? 13 colonies were now 24 states, home to millions of men and women, stretching from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River and beyond. The economy, transformed by a second war with Great Britain, crashed in 1819, spreading misery far and wide. A passionate debate over the westward expansion of slavery when Missouri is admitted into the Union flares antagonisms between the northern and southern states. These stresses animated in 1824 a strange presidential election, one-party contest between four men. The party is Democratic-Republican, The Federals had ceased to be a player at the presidential level at this point, and the candidates are John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford. Their partisans campaign along sectional battle lines. They fight so bitterly that observers wonder if the Union can withstand the contest. One Maine editor commented that the citizens, quote, piping themselves out of breath to the tune of the North and the South sounds too much like the death of liberty to suit our ears. But there was another subtext to this acrimonious election. On its surface, it was best represented by President James Monroe's pending departure from public life. Like every previous president, he had participated in the Revolution, either as a soldier or as a statesman. He was a friend to both Lee and Lafayette. Whoever succeeded Monroe would be the first of a second generation of Americans to lead the nation. And his transition worried Americans. They were fearful they might spoil all that their dying fathers and mothers had built. They were anxious about guiding the country into the future. And the citizens moved towards it. They glanced back to the past with a sense of painful nostalgia and a sense of historic homesickness. Accordingly, when on August 15th, the Cadmus at last reached Staten Island and Lafayette again stepped on American soil, it was at the time when both he and the American people needed the reunion the most. That afternoon, rain clouds cleared, and Lafayette was received by the Vice President, Daniel Tompkins, at his home. A giant rainbow appeared, a sign, Lafayette said, of happy omens. The following afternoon, when the general arrived in Manhattan and disembarked at the Battery in front of a crowd of thousands, Lafayette mania erupted, and a national tour unseen since began. We have any Taylor Swift fans here? Sometimes they get offended when I say that. As he was drawn up Broadway to the City Hall, buildings and houses were in his path were draped with bunting and densely packed. Men huzzaed, women tossed white handkerchiefs. Some New Yorkers who were so overcome by the sight of the old hero rushed towards his carriage and attempted to unhook the horses so they could carry it to City Hall themselves. Over the next 13 months, Lafayette traveled to all 24 states, actually 25, because he was in what is now West Virginia, which was at the time Virginia, and received the same enthusiastic reactions wherever he went. On the way to Boston, we departed in August 1824, shortly after arriving in New York. Businesses were closed in anticipation of his arrival. If his path did not run through their communities, New Englanders rushed to the ones where it did. If he had departed before they arrived, they embarked for the next town in hot pursuit. Schools were dismissed. Roads were filled with young boys hoping to catch up with the procession. The line of admirers following it grew so large that the cloud of dust that it kicked into the air could be seen for miles on the horizon and choked anyone in its wake. Even the horses pulling Lafayette were reminded of the weight and honor of their task. While a new carriage was being equipped in a Connecticut town, its driver warned one of his horses, "Behave pretty now, Charlie. You're going to carry the greatest man in the world." In Boston, crowds thronged the city streets as columns of schoolchildren greeted the nation's guest as Americans took to calling him on the Common. One observer wrote that it seemed more like a dream of romance than reality. When he entered Philadelphia, it was at the head of a lengthy parade filled with fellow Revolutionary veterans. The procession ended at Independence Hall, elegantly refurbished for the occasion and wound under numerous ceremonial arches. At Baltimore, Washington's old tents awaited at Fort McHenry. In Washington, he visited the Capitol, the rotunda of which had just been completed in time for his visit. He stopped by the unpretentious home of the president. And then, of course, on October 17th, the great set piece of the visit, Lafayette's return to Mount Vernon, where he disappeared into the crypt and returned with tears streaking down his face. But before that visit, Lafayette's carriage stopped at a house on Orinoco Street in Alexandria. He'd come to pay respects to Anne Hill Carter Lee, the widow of Lafayette's old friend, Henry Lee III. Lee's son, Robert, who would depart for West Point the following year, was likely among the cavalry marching with Lafayette into Alexandria. After his visit to Mount Vernon and a celebration at Yorktown, Lafayette made his way to Monticello. We rested for several days with his old friend Thomas Jefferson, and then visited with James Madison at Montpelier. The way there was delayed because of celebrations in Richmond and elsewhere. but also because of the election. The same bitter presidential contest, the one that had portended disunion and ruin, was an object of far less passion after Lafayette had arrived. Lafayette took note. He also took a little credit. He sensed that it was not just his presence, which itself evoked the ghost of Washington, but the sight of all the old soldiers of the Revolution who had come to greet him, which had rallied the nation together in gratitude to its benefactors. I have the satisfaction of thinking that my presence has had a great effect between the two parties. Men who have not spoken to each other for 20 years are brought together and mutually invited to celebrate us, he said. All because, as he wrote, memories of the Revolution have come back to life. During the second leg of his tour, which began in February 1825, Lafayette traveled into America's South along its western frontier. He left Washington late February 1825. He traveled south to Savannah, over to New Orleans, up to St. Louis, then back east, arriving in Boston just in time to participate in the laying of the cornerstone of a monument at Bunker Hill on the 50th anniversary of the battle on June 17th. Once the dedication ceremony was completed, there was a covered pavilion that was designated for guests of honor, shielding them from the hot afternoon sun. Lafayette refused to take his place under it, insisting he belong among his fellow veterans as the representative of the old army. He took a seat under the hot sun surrounded by a sea of heads with white or thinning hair. His silver trumpets were pressed up to ears to amplify the speakers' voices. The monument that he raced across the country to help begin was finished in 1843, an obelisk stretching 221 feet into the sky. But also, as its planners had hoped, a generational bridge linking Americans to their original benefactors. In a sense, though it was not technically the end of his tour, it was the culmination, his presiding over the consecration of the memory of the Revolution, which had so rallied the nation together in the lead up to the 50th anniversary of its birth. Shortly before his departure for France in September, Lafayette told William Winston Seton, the publisher of the National Intelligencer, Washington newspaper, that he was stunned by the, quote, magical changes across America, its wealth, its population, its art. Seton's wife, Sarah, wrote to her mother that Lafayette, quote, in the most touching strain, spoke of the springtime of his youth, when visions of hope were strong, and in which, in age, had the singular felicity of seeing realized. Now, over the past few months, I've related the story of Lafayette's tour to audiences. I'm out promoting a book about it, naturally. But I think there's a real connection to it and the 250th of the country. Now, last year was the bicentennial of Lafayette's tour. I missed it with my publication by a couple weeks, but I actually think that's good because it's a story in the book can teach us, I think, how we can approach celebrating our country's history this year. But I also think I was challenged because I was had to incorporate Light Horse into this talk as well, and I spent some time thinking about how his story can also inform how we reflect on our history this year. I think the top line here is that both of these lives remind us of the importance of serving causes greater than ourselves, of revering our veterans, both our Revolutionary veterans and all our veterans. Lee and Lafayette were both great advocates for their fellow soldiers. I think the excitement about Lafayette's return, why it was such a national phenomenon, it was because Lafayette was special. He was not identified with any state, any political faction. All Americans could celebrate him. And obviously his sacrifice is unique, crossing an ocean, spending his own fortune, risking his life for people he didn't know in a country he'd never been to. But I also think the celebration was about all the other veterans who showed up, to all the old men in the crowd at Bunker Hill with white or thinning hair. And it's interesting to me that Congress voted Lafayette in December of 1824, $200,000 as compensation for his service in the Revolution at a time when, although pensions for the Revolutionary veterans had become increasingly more generous, when they weren't still widely available and they were difficult to obtain, they required a lot of work to prove the veteran's service and also the veteran's hardship. It's one of the reasons why Revolutionary veterans' pensions have so much information in them. So Lafayette was granted $200,000. The debates in Congress are interesting. Almost all members of Congress voted to give Lafayette the money. I mean, it would be political suicide not to. The whole country was mad with Lafayette fever. But those who objected because they felt it wasn't right to give $200,000 to Lafayette with little in the way of actual examining his service and proof when there were veterans who showed up still begging for pensions. I was shown a letter just yesterday or the day before by a private collector from Lafayette written after his tour when he is writing to some fellow veterans saying, if any good came from Congress giving me $200,000, it should be that they realize they can give money to other veterans too, which I thought was pretty moving and showed how much he cared for his fellow veterans. And Lee himself, he was fighting for pensions for his fellow veterans almost as soon as the war was over, and he envisioned service in the Revolutionary Army as the greatest thing that any American could provide for his country. It's one of the reasons he felt that he belonged to the leadership class. I think also both their stories remind us of the power of common memory and also myth. They can bridge division, which we have a lot of in this country right now. And it doesn't mean that we have to abandon our very important political debates. In fact, men like Washington and Lee and Lafayette fought in a revolution so we could have those debates. So we shouldn't be abandoning them. But I think we can put our passions in perspective when we think about our revolution and our revolutionary heroes and to find a place to come together in shared citizenship outside of politics. In the Federalist Papers, number 14, James Madison reasoned that Americans were knit together by so many cords of affection. And I think memories of our revolution, to borrow Lafayette's term, can help remind us of those connections. I think they can also remind us of our values and our institutions, the ones which our revolutionaries fought for, which were singular in 1776, they were singular in 1824, and they're singular in 2026. Though we forget it at times, all of us. And I think Lafayette's tour can remind us that our revolution is ongoing. I was talking to Cameron about this just on our way here. We just passed through a period where I think we have had a hypercritical attitude towards our heroes, which isn't a bad thing to think about, that our heroes are imperfect men. Of course, if that's the criteria for our heroes, perfection, then we won't have any heroes. And I think we're moving a little bit away from confusing being thoughtful and contemplating complexities versus erasing people. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a fulsome recollection of our history while we celebrate our country. You know, Lee was an incredibly complicated man. He was obsessed with virtue, and he wrote letters to his sons telling them, emulate George Washington, read the classics. But he himself was compromised in many ways. But as Cameron said to me today, he was aspirational. And we need aspirations, we need ideals. Otherwise, all our public squares will have no monuments at all. You know, Lafayette, during his travels in America in 1824 and 1825, was amazed by what he'd seen, the transformation made possible by the Revolution. And it's my favorite quote that I found when I was writing this book on Lafayette. It was in a letter he sent back to a fellow French veteran of the Revolution. He said he'd just come back from a tour up the Hudson River in September of 1824, and he said, "You cannot imagine how I was struck by the miracle wrought here by 48 years in independence, instruction in government, and liberty. It surpasses my imagination, I know." Now, he was taking, a lot of that was affirmation, because he'd seen the revolution that he had fought in had been a success. He'd seen the flower of his own sacrifices, which Lee didn't quite live to see. But as thrilled as he was by the progress that he beheld during his tour, he didn't ignore areas where the revolution was incomplete. When he was in New Orleans in the spring of 1825, he wrote, "There's only one issue for which I am less resigned than ever, and that is slavery and anti-black prejudice. But rather than scold his hosts or denigrate their achievements, Lafayette, who famously had opposed slavery and conceived of ways to end it, spoke by polite gesture. He visited in plain view with black men who had served in the Revolution, and with a battalion of free black men who had fought alongside Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. He pointed out the hypocrisy of slavery in a nation dedicated to the rights of men whose freedom he had helped win. He could take incredible joy and pride in the progress he saw in America, but also signal to its leaders and to its citizens that there was great work remaining. So I think Lafayette, and also Lee, who had a complicated relationship at the end of his life with this country, would argue that the world is better off because of America. Perhaps they would also confess that America has some imperfections, but no other country has worked so hard to remedy those imperfections. So Lafayette might also add that where there are areas where work remains, the framers and the revolutionaries left behind the tools to future generations of Americans to address them and to continue the revolution. And I think that is the noble history of this great nation over the last 250 years. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that talk. We'll open it up to a couple questions from the audience, and as we get a hand up, I'll ask the first question. Because Robert E. Lee is the Lee that people remember today, and his father is largely forgotten, is there any sort of 1-2 sentence takeaway you can give on why Light Horse Harry Lee merits study alongside other members of the family, other revolutionary figures?
Yeah, I think if Robert E. Lee had never been born, Henry Lee III would still be worth studying. There was a letter I found when I was writing the book on Lee. Now, it's been so many years. I may get some details wrong. You have to forgive me. But I think it was written by James Madison during the Constitutional Convention in Richmond to Alexander Hamilton, where Madison was relaying to Hamilton, who at the time was involved in a constitutional convention in New York, about the progress in Richmond. And on the letter, there's an arrow at the bottom of one of the pages that says turn over, and on the reverse is a note from Lee to Hamilton. So Madison and Lee were together, and I imagine he was saying, I'm writing to Hamilton. Oh, can I include, the reason I'm telling you this story is Henry Lee III was a founding father. He participated in important political debates, the ratification of the Constitution here in Virginia. Virginia ratified it after I believe New Hampshire, but it was still hugely important for one of the largest states to ratify the Constitution for the legitimacy. So it's an important thing. Obviously, his service as Virginia's governor, he's most famously known, other than being Robert E. Lee's father, for his eulogy of Washington, which a lot of people can quote without knowing who actually said it. It's kind of programmed into American mind. If I had, my talk was overlong. If I had, kept you here all night, I could have recited more lines from it. It's a beautiful oration, and it's worth reading in its entirety. I think it's one of the high watermarks of early American oration. I think that's important. And you mentioned his sacrifice on behalf of free press, even if he didn't necessarily conceive it as that, of the rights of another American to criticize the government. And Baltimore is important. He was involved with a lot of things that were significant in the early years of the Republic. And of course, his service in the Revolution was important. He helped win our freedom. So even without his connection to Robert E. Lee, he's a notable historic figure.
So, people talk a lot about Robert E. Lee and how he's like the model gentleman. And after learning about Light Horse Harry Lee, I thought, it makes sense that he became such a good gentleman when his father was, the assistant to George Washington and a revered warrior. But it sounds like you're kind of saying he might not have been the best role model or might not have been the most involved. So how involved or how much responsibility do you think we should give to Light Horse Harry Lee for sort of the positive development of Robert E. Lee?
A lot, actually, but not in the way that you would think. I think you could write a book about this, and I think there's been some essays written about it. If you look at their lives together, they're quite different in terms of, I think Robert E. Lee had a fear of debt. He was incredibly faithful to his wife and children, right? hated to be away from them. He was deeply religious. He had his life, we would put in our parlance, he had his life together, right? His personal life together. I think a lot of that probably was from the stigma of his father and also his older brother, Henry Lee IV, whose life was a mess also, and lost Stratford Hall, and there was rumors about infidelity, and also lived a tragic life. And I think those influences, I mean, we'll never know, we'll never be able to talk to him, but I think those influences probably, in a way, intuited. Like, he wasn't influenced by his father directly, but he kind of intuited ways to live his life that were not like his father. But on the battlefield, I think there's something hereditary in the sense of the bearing and the presence. And that I always love that quote, which is taken from a Revolutionary War veterans pension about Lafayette at Guilford Courthouse. I think it's Guilford Courthouse, prowling across the lines of militia with rage for war on his face. He had a talent for leadership, military leadership, which Robert had also. So in terms of on the battlefield, I think there's a direct connection. And then I think in the personal life, I think he tried in some way, whether by intention or by instinct, to be unlike his father. But I think we know that he cared about his father. He visited his father's grave twice before he was moved here in 1913. So it's a complex question. It's a good one.
Do the French celebrate their revolution at all?
Not like we celebrate ours. I mean, they have Bastille Day, right? But not we. Actually, Cameron and I were talking about this too. It's such a different revolution than ours. It was ours. Ours was a reassertion of values. We were saying we want these values restored. The French Revolution was creating a whole new system, which then grew out of control, and as you just said, increasingly violent and radical. So I think we have something more significant to celebrate than they do.
I've heard that. I've heard that that Lafayette had himself buried under American soil in France. Is that something you ran across?
Yeah, I believe it's true. I saw that in reports. There, in particular, the soil was dug up during the tour when Lafayette was here at Bunker Hill. Now, I can't confirm, I didn't put it in my book, that they were carrying soil. His son and secretary were carrying soil along the tour. They were I'm really just telling this story to make the book sound exciting, so you buy it. But they were in a shipwreck on the Ohio River between Indiana and Kentucky, and Lafayette lost a number of possessions during that. And I've seen it, some people say that there was some soil that they were collecting to take home during that was lost, but I never actually saw that in any verifiable sources. But they did take soil from Bunker Hill that he was buried under.
Clifford Dowdy, in his biography of Robert E. Lee, notes that Light Horse Harry's time both as master of Stratford Hall and governor were marked primarily by fecklessness and financial mismanagement. To what degree was that a character fault of his, and to what degree was he rather just a man of his time? Because Monroe, Jefferson, and the Prince of Wales, he was so hesitant to condemn, were also known for their attachment to debt.
It was like the land speculation was a national pastime for the affluent classes at the time. Washington, Robert Morris. There's a whole list of founders who did it, and some who ended up in jail for it. So the answer is, I think he was a man of his time. I think that he wasn't particularly skilled at the pastime of his time, and I think also certain elements of his personality made that worse. The ambition, the desire for fortune, a recklessness. I don't think, my takeaway when I was writing the book was that he wasn't a terrible person, but that circumstances made him a terrible person. That's no excuse. I know that's no excuse, but he was increasingly backed into a corner and acted out in a way of someone who had made a complete mess of their financial life and was on the run continually. It's one of the reasons why he was an absent father for Robert and his siblings. I don't know if that was a sufficient answer, but...
So I hate to have to cut off the questions, but we do need to make sure we can get to the reception in time. Can we give Ryan another round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you.
And if you'd like to judge for yourself if Light Horse Harry Lee was a terrible person, I'd recommend coming to the reception, getting a copy of Ryan's book. Thanks for joining us this Founders Day. Have a great weekend, and go Generals.